So I'm going to talk about the electricity sector in Ireland and carbon emissions and importing. And I'm going to talk about good news, all right? And I think in Ireland, when it comes to good news and climate, we don't know how to react. We're so used to getting bad news sometimes that when good things happen, when things happen that are supposed to be happening, we still complain and we don't know how to accept it, how to absorb it. But there is good news within the power sector in Ireland over the last number of years, particularly around imports. And that big news story, or that good news story, is that Ireland achieved significant emissions reduction from the importation of large volumes of electricity from the UK. Okay, so we achieved a really big greenhouse gas pollution reduction, primarily linked to those importations. And when that news came out, there was jubilation and there was also consternation. So why aren't we doing this correctly? Why are we outsourcing our pollution to the UK? Why can't we ever get this right? Why are we always wrong? And what's happening? And so we took this question in UCC and we kind of teased it and said, well, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing from a climate perspective? And we ran the numbers and we looked at the data and we found that it's actually a very good thing and it's a very positive thing, and the carbon markets are doing what they're supposed to be doing from an environmental perspective and also from an economic perspective. So I'm going to chat to you just through the kind of the thinking that we did to arrive at that conclusion. But to inoculate you against uncertainty, I just want to give you one bit of advice, first of all. Not advice, but one insight that people often don't appreciate when it comes to the power sector in Ireland. Okay, so Ireland, we had Laura chatting this morning, and Ireland is Ireland is still massively reliant on fossil fuels. We're one of the most fossil fuel reliant economies in Northwest Europe, and our electricity sector is none different. We are one of the most fossil fuel reliant electricity sectors in Northwest Europe. Yes, we're doing great things with wind, about 40%, but there's about 50% or so that's primarily natural gas, little bits of coal, little bits of oil. And a consequence of that reliance on fossil fuel means we have a lot of greenhouse gas pollution in our power sector still in Ireland, so much so that Ireland's power sector is still one of the dirtiest power sectors in Northwest Europe. The amount of carbon pollution per 1 unit of electricity produced in Ireland is significantly higher than most other European countries. And even our friends and colleagues in the UK, our carbon pollution is about twice as high as their carbon pollution per unit of electricity produced. Okay, so think that, remember it, because that will kind of explain, I suppose, where we're going with this story. Now, when it comes to carbon accounting and emissions accounting, we use a production-based accounting system. That means the pollution is accounted for where it is produced. And then when this news broke, Ireland had achieved significant emissions reduction. People said, it's not fair, that's a terrible system, it's skewed in favour of electricity. Well, no, it isn't. We do production accounting emissions for pretty much everything. This desk, wherever it was produced, the emissions and the pollution associated with the manufacturing, the making of this desk, I'm sure it probably wasn't made in Ireland, but wherever it was produced, that's where the emissions are counted. The seat that you are sitting on, I presume that wasn't probably made in Ireland, that the emissions and the pollution that's associated with production of that seat is counted in that country. Same with electricity. The tomatoes that we had for lunch, wherever those tomatoes are grown, the pollution associated with those tomatoes is counted for once in the country where it's produced, not here. Same for electricity. Electricity that's produced in the UK is counted in the national balance sheets for the UK in their inventories, and we don't account it again here in Ireland. That's production-based accounting. It cuts both ways, by the way. Our agricultural sector will argue that it's unfair for them, and it probably is, because that means the meat that we produce here in Ireland, which is consumed in other countries, the pollution from the production of that meat is counted here, okay? And you can argue whether it's right or wrong, but it's the rules of the system. And that's what we have to work with. So down in UCC, one of my master's students, Brian Hooley, really sharp fifth-year master's student, crunched all the numbers. Brian took the data, and you have to take the numbers at a really high granular level. You have to look at this thing at a kind of a 15-minute by 15-minute level. Took all the data for 2024, looked at the generation in the UK, looked at the emissions pollution in the UK, looked at the interconnector flows, looked at them in Northern Ireland, Ireland, demand, flows, pollution. We crunched all the numbers at a 15-minute resolution, added it all up for 2024, and this is what we found. The pollution associated with the production of electricity for Ireland in the UK accumulated about 700,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. That's a lot, okay? 700,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent goes on the UK inventories. Now, by the way, there's a carbon price paid on that, and there's a carbon price floor paid on that in the UK. So it's not there's no kind of distortion of market economics here. Then the question becomes, if we were to produce the same amount of electricity at the same time, meeting the same need in Ireland, with the wind speeds and the sunshine, the plants that were online at the time, what would have been the counterfactual pollution? We found that the counterfactual pollution in Ireland would have been 1.3 million tonnes. So producing the same amount of power here in Ireland at the same time, at the same moment, would have released about 1.3 million tonnes of pollution up into the atmosphere. Producing it in the UK was 700,000 tonnes. So about roughly, let's make the math simple on myself, about a 50% reduction in emissions. That's a good thing from a net perspective. It's good for Ireland. Now that shows up at zero on our national inventories for the production-based emissions that we use here in Ireland. And there's nothing underhanded about that. Remember, that applies to everything. Electricity is not getting special treatment here. And from a net environmental benefit, there's a significant net reduction of about 600,000 tonnes. That's roughly about 300,000 cars taken off the road. So it's good for Ireland, it's good for Planet Inc., and it is a positive thing, okay? Now, this brings us on to CBAM. When you look at something like CBAM, and I get the logic for CBAM for things like aluminium and coal and those physical commodities that we talked about this morning, applying CBAM to electricity, particularly for UK and Ireland, is a little bit different. And to be honest, I would be a little bit skeptical, because the spirit of CBAM is to reduce the risk of carbon leakage. There is no carbon leakage happening between Ireland and UK. It's whatever the opposite of leakage is, that is what's happening at the moment. So it's a good thing, okay? The other kind of, I suppose, counter spirit, or the other accompanying spirit of CBAM, is to make sure there's a fair carbon price put on pollution. The UK, as Matt mentioned this morning, has got a really good UK ETS system, plus a carbon price floor. So there is a carbon price already being applied to pollution that has been produced in the UK. There's very little risk of carbon leakage. In fact, the numbers that Brian Hooley, my student, ran, we found that the carbon intensity in the UK was lower than Ireland about 95% of the time, okay? That's pretty good from a carbon accounting method. The other challenge with CBAM when it comes to applying it to electricity imports is that there's a really kind of skewed logic in terms of emissions factors that CBAM proposes to assign to electricity coming from third-party countries based on an average weighted element of fossil fuels over 5 years. That artificially inflates the carbon pollution coming from fossil fuels, and I think it's a flawed logic and not a good logic. The other challenge for us here in Ireland, and that really calls into the question the value of CBAM, is that we have a really good functioning all-island market with our friends and colleagues up in Northern Ireland. Adding anything about carbon would probably only frustrate those good relationships that we have at the moment. And when you stand back from it and kind of look at what needs to be achieved here, there isn't a lot of evidence or logic to demonstrate that CBAM would meaningfully reduce emissions over and above what has been achieved today, right? And I think Ireland needs to be cognizant of that, needs to be aware of our important relationship with the UK and with Northern Ireland, and as well, there needs to be a demonstrable carbon reduction benefit for Ireland to go along with this. So I would be sceptical and careful of Ireland going down the road of a CBAM. I know there's conversations going on with the UK and Europe at the moment. Hopefully they'll be resolved, and hopefully the CBAM, when it comes to electricity, will be simplified or reduced to a certain extent that will hopefully allow us to get on with the job that we're doing here. The other challenge that CBAM introduces from an electricity specific perspective, and I'm talking here about electricity only, is that the reporting is quite arduous, it's quite heavy. You look, and you know, EPA and our state agencies are already doing great work. I would say many of them are being overstretched and have enough things to do with the real things that do reduce emissions. Adding on another element of arduous reporting without a clear benefit from an emissions perspective, I think really needs to be called into question. So CBAM from a commodities perspective, I think is very, very positive and has some good elements to it. From an electricity perspective for Ireland and UK perspective, I think we need to be careful because there are sensitivities there that needs to be acknowledged. And if there isn't evidence to demonstrate that there's meaningful emissions reduction, then you have to question the value of it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.